How big is too big, and how did we forget to plan for the expansion? More on that next. You're watching The Drum. Four Corners tonight considers the question, how did Australia forget to develop a population policy? Since 2005, net overseas migration, which includes the increase in temporary migrants, has averaged 200,000 people per year, up from 100,000 in the previous decade. It is predicted to be around 240,000 per year over the next few years. As a result, Sydney and Melbourne are developing into megacities without any real planning for how that might happen.
Now, if you live in a major Australian city, you know that the population is growing. The trains are more crowded and the roads are more congested. But did you know that our population is actually growing faster than some of our Asian neighbours like Indonesia? We're growing faster than the UK and Canada. When you think about how big Melbourne and Sydney are now, well, that is where Perth and Brisbane are headed. So even though our population is growing at a faster rate than the US or the UK, our birth rates are pretty much the same. So the difference is immigration. Last year, migration accounted for nearly 2/3 of our population growth.
Craig, I'm going to ask you the question. You are in local government. The immigration numbers are set in the budget every year, and people in local and state governments are expected to build the infrastructure to make that happen. What have you people been doing?
Well, clearly not enough. You know, with that number of immigrants coming to Australia each year, we are having to scramble to build infrastructure locally and globally. This is not a new problem for the rest of the world. 70% of the world's population are going to live in cities by 2030. So Sydney and Melbourne are no different. Local governments got a big challenge where at the one time rolling out new housing, 38,000 homes in Sydney alone each year have to be built to cope with this population increase, and we haven't been keeping up with open space and schools and local roads and those sorts of things. So I think we've got a big catch-up game going on. One of the things that I think local government is doing is looking at how do we maximise the use of our resources and facilities. And a great example is our playing fields. With so many units being built, where do kids play?
Sure thing.
So getting more than 15 hours per week out of a playing surface has to be something that we prioritise. But
it literally comes down to that, doesn't it? The person from the AFL and the person from the soccer club and the person from the netball club all saying about this tiny little piece of grass that everybody brings their cavoodle onto to do you know what. How are we going to share this piece of grass? So what I'm interested in trying to figure out is when Canberra decides, OK, we're going to increase the net migration from 100,000 to 200,000, do they get on the blow and ring up City of Sydney Council and say, now listen, you're going to have to do the planning that goes along with this, or do they expect that that will just trickle down to you guys?
Well, we certainly don't hear from Canberra about these sorts of things.
Is there no coordinated planning, really? Real question.
My understanding is there isn't. But certainly in New South Wales, there are things like the Greater Sydney Commission where they're trying to say, look, what do we want the future of our city to look like in that sort of space? So I do think that there is some forward planning, and a lot of local governments are involved in that. If you look at the Western Sydney deal that was just announced, there's 8 councils that are involved with that, along with the Western Sydney Corporation, Transport for New South Wales. A lot of agencies are involved in trying to plan for how that looks. And I think that's one of the great opportunities that we've got here in Sydney. And I think it's happening in other places. Melbourne, there are plans for satellite cities just outside of Melbourne. And these are opportunities to say, look, we've done it wrong in the past. How do we plan for the future?
And Eliane, I want to ask you, when you look at the who is coming to Australia, you see a lot of people coming from India and from China in a skilled migration program, right? The program tonight talks about vertical living and talks about vertical schools. Does that actually matter?
Absolutely. I think our cities just can't contain the number of people who will call Australia home if we don't do something different in terms of how we live our lifestyle and how we adapt to a greater densification in terms of our living. So by 2050, both Sydney and Melbourne will be 8 million. How do we cater for that type of population growth? It's a challenge when Australians have in their minds that they still want the backyard, the house with the game of cricket, the hills hoist. And there's no real change in the proportion of Australians that are dropping their commute via cars, for example. And so there are challenges when it comes to lifestyle and expectations around around us as a global city here in Sydney, in Melbourne, in Brisbane as well, our proximity to Asia and what that means for Sydney, for Australia in 2030. So I think we need to adapt. We see that most of the migrants who move to Australia, 86% of them settle in capital cities. And so what it means for many Australians on the fringes is that they've gone, well, I don't want to deal with this. I'll move to a city that's less expensive, for example. And so we are seeing that cultural diversity increase in our cities, and therefore I guess the difference between those who live in the country and those in the cities is growing in terms of cultural diversity as well as other factors.
Peter, I want to introduce another idea. Let me read this. Is the problem that we just can't bear to have the conversation about a big Australia? Remember the furore in 2009 when Kevin Rudd said those two dirty words?
I actually believe in a big Australia. I make no apology for that. I actually think it's good news that our population is growing. Contrast that with many countries in Europe, where in fact it's heading in the reverse direction. I think it's good for us, it's good for our national security long term, it's good in terms of what we can sustain as a nation.
Yep, they were two dirty words, big and Australia. Mr Rudd's comments aggravated a grand coalition of Australians, environmentalists, rednecks, NIMBYs and frankly anyone who sits in an hour of traffic every day to get to work. Nearly a decade on, it's still touchy political territory. Here's Home Affairs Minister Peter Dutton being asked about putting the brakes on migration levels just last month.
We have to try and encourage people out into regions. We have to reduce the numbers where we believe it's in our national interest, and we've done that, as I say, by over 100,000 from just off the top of my head the numbers since Labor was in. It's come back considerably, and if we have to bring it back further, if that's what's required and that's what's in our country's best interest, Ray, that is what we'll do.
Well, then Tony Abbott weighed in.
Managing the overall numbers down to the old long-term average of 110,000 a year would inconvenience some businesses, but that's hardly unreasonable if it helps wages to grow more strongly and makes homes more affordable. Scaling back immigration acknowledges that the government's first duty is to its own citizens.
Earning this rebuke from the Treasurer.
I was the Immigration Minister for Tony Abbott, and the permanent immigration intake that we have today is exactly the same as it was when he was Prime Minister. And I don't recall at any time there was any discussion that that should be lowered at that time, and I do recall housing affordability being a significant issue.
So, looking back to 2009, Kevin Rudd said those words, big Australia. What happened after he said them?
Well, he refused to say them ever again. He was asked repeatedly by journalists, do you still support a big Australia? And he never gave us a clear yes. So he ran away from it. It's an interesting one politically, this. Firstly, to Tony Abbott on that. In fairness to him, he disputes what Scott Morrison was arguing. He disputes that inside Cabinet he apparently was raising this when he was Prime Minister, but no one else was interested.
But it seems like you can't have either conversation. You're not allowed to talk about a big Australia. Everyone will get frightened about density. And you're not allowed to talk about reducing immigration numbers for livability because everyone will call you a racist.
And it's more complicated than that even, because you've got this scenario where governments are reliant on this macro picture of growth, and immigration, high immigration, helps with national growth.
Yeah.
But as individuals, it doesn't necessarily mean that individuals are getting wealthier. It just means that as a nation we are. So at the macro level, treasurers love it because then they can talk about growth figures and bang on about that. But individual MPs, particularly in marginal seats that are looking like they're getting a bit more dense, and there's other issues at play as well, some of which you mentioned, they're not as comfortable about it. And there's another massive industry, I should put my academic hat on for this one, higher education, heavily underfunded for a long time by governments, relies on overseas students coming here, full fee paying students, and up until a recent policy change, they get pretty much automatic entry as migrants after they complete their degrees. It's our second largest export industry. Governments like this idea that it provides the economic growth of immigration. They're skilled migrants at that. It also props up the second biggest industry, and it means they don't need to fund higher education significantly. There has been a policy change in that space, so immigration numbers will naturally, I think, come down a little bit anyway, not to the extent that Tony Abbott wants. But there's so many complexities in this debate, and that's before you even deal with the fact that you can't have a complex debate, because look at what happened to Kevin Rudd when he was prepared to dare utter those two words.
But Craig, I'm interested. I mean, the Grattan Institute put out a report a couple of weeks ago on housing affordability. They talked about the need to have an explicit population policy that defines appropriate levels of migration, and said that there may need to be a reduction in levels to support well-being. I mean, does local and state government need to ease migration levels until the planning and the policy and the national conversation catches up?
Well, local government doesn't really get a say in who moves into our areas. Our housing policies, for instance in Sydney, are around things like housing affordability and land use in the area. But where we don't meet our targets for housing, state government will come along and impose a planning regime that will allow for more housing to go in that site. You know, how's the average punter supposed to really understand this debate when you've got politicians who flip and flop, where you can't actually have a logical discussion about a policy around immigration, about density and population? The average punter finds it hard to follow along with this, and so really it's very, very confusing. I think the one thing that they do know is that the streets are congested, the trains are congested, there's apartments going up in their block, and they just don't understand what's going on.
I mean, Eliane, you're a demographer. Is the way to have this conversation to frame it as a quality of life conversation? Is there a way to have a sensible conversation about this as Australians?
I think there's a reality that needs to be faced here. 20 years ago, we predicted that we'd hit 25 million by 2050. We're more than 30 years ahead of schedule, and hence the challenges in the planning agenda. Now, at the consumer level, at the individual level, I think there is a question around how are we going to make this work? And I think we just need to expedite the rate at which we actually start to think critically about how we're going to do those things, how we're going to build schools, infrastructure, hospitals, etc., to keep up with that population growth and adapt our lifestyle accordingly.
And politics is getting worse, Ellen, because you've got this scenario where it's getting shorter in its time frames, its political cycles, yet you need long-term thinking on something like this, and you need cooperation between tiers of government. We have not had this white paper process for federation reform. It's a mess.